Donkey Kong is a difficult game to talk about, not because the game is so good or bad, but because what do you say about a game that's as historical as this? Talking about Donkey Kong is like talking about Space Invaders, Pong, or Asteroids, games that are so core to the story of video games that they've been talked about to hell and back. Part of me feels like there's not really much more to say about it. It's like trying to come up with an original take on Mario 64 or making sense of the way that Twitch enforces their content guidelines.
Whoa! This is worthless.
For this reason, I'm going to kind of speed run the background portion of this video, as I'm pretty sure most of you guys already know a lot of this by now. But if you're straight up noob or actually do something productive in your free time, then here's the rundown. Donkey Kong was the first big success for Nintendo of America, who was reeling from the failure of the Radar Scope, which was an F-tier space shooter. Nintendo wanted a game to compete with the sensation of Pac-Man, as well as crack into the North American market. Bring in Shigeru Miyamoto, and he was directing Donkey Kong under the supervision of Gunpei Yokoi. Miyamoto and Nintendo initially wanted the game to be a Popeye game, but the rights situation fell through, leading Miyamoto to change the idea to a big ape, known as Donkey Kong or Stupid Ape. According to Miyamoto, the concept for the game was there before any work was actually began, which would be a first in the company and a style that he would use going forward to make games like Zelda. The development was pretty straightforward, but the developers were not pleased with Miyamoto. He wanted the game to have more than one screen on it, and said that he wanted multiple stages. It sounds ridiculous now, but the idea of levels was still so new to the developers that they were complaining that Miyamoto essentially wanted them to make more than one game. Nintendo took the game to their North American branch, and even though the Americans were a little bit concerned about the product due to how different it was, they were willing to give it a try. And by willing to give it a try, I mean they needed to. This was really a make or break moment for Nintendo of America, who had yet to ship a successful product. The American staff made up the names for the characters. The lady was renamed Pauline after the warehouse manager's wife, Jumpman was named Mario after Mario Segal, and like I said, Donkey Kong already had his name. After a small test run in the Washington area, the game was released officially on July 31st, 1981 to pretty immediate success. The Nintendo of America crew got to work converting old Radar Scope machines over into Donkey Kong machines as more orders came in. At one point, they were selling about 4,000 machines a month and made $180 million off of Donkey Kong alone by June of 1982, less than a year after the release of the game. This success would launch Nintendo as a brand, Mario as a character, and the platformer as a new genre. From this point on, the game would appear on multiple different machines, with a bunch of different ports securing the foothold to make Nintendo a household name. But it was not all smooth sailing when Universal swung their big boy balls in and took Nintendo to court.
Big old balls!
Universal was under the impression that Nintendo had stolen their intellectual properties to the King Kong property, and after the massive success of the game, they thought that they were entitled to a piece of that big ape pie. After many failed attempts at getting royalties from Nintendo, Universal decided that enough was enough and took them to court in 1982 over the entire ordeal. This court case would result in one of the more pathetic cases of self-humiliation that I've ever seen. There's a whole King Kong copyright saga which is as old as the film itself, and I don't really have time to get into that here. Long story short, at different points in time, different studios, companies, and individuals have held fast that the character or characters are their own intellectual property. At this point in time, Universal was under the impression that King Kong was their intellectual property, King Kong being the ape himself, which they said that Nintendo was using in Donkey Kong. This would be fine if Universal had not already proven themselves that the character of King Kong was public domain. See, back in 1975, RKO Pictures, the original film company behind King Kong, laid a lawsuit out against Universal after hearing that they were going to make a movie using Kong. Universal successfully argued in court that it would be fine for them to do so as long as they were not remaking the original RKO picture and instead just using the characters from the original script. Due to the fact that Universal didn't want to pay RKO the royalties for Kong, they successfully put Kong into the public domain in this court case. Due to this previous case, the judge at the Nintendo court case said that they weren't going to side with Universal because there was already enough reason to say that King Kong was public domain. He would further admonish Universal by saying, "Throughout this litigation, Universal knew, as a result of the RKO litigation, that it has no rights to any visual image of King Kong from the classic movie or its remake. Nonetheless, Universal, when it seems beneficial, made sweeping assertions of rights, attempting to extract license agreements from companies incapable of, or unwilling to, confront Universal's profit center." Universal would continue to hound Nintendo for the next few years, but never got the legal victory they wanted. Instead, Nintendo solidified itself as a force to be reckoned with, cementing a legal and market success. With all that out of the way, how is the game itself? Well, it's Donkey Kong. Look, the other reason that Donkey Kong is hard to talk about, I'm really not a big fan of it. In fact, before looking into the history further, I was ready to tear this game apart. I know that the game is from 1981, but even then, it just feels stiff, slow, and sluggish. Mario feels like three hungover Shibas in a trench coat trying to make their way around a construction site. Despite his initial name being Jumpman, he gets about as far off the ground as a fat guy would, making jumping the barrels a decent challenge. If you're coming back from future Mario games, like I am, this one is really difficult to come back to. The physics just feel off. And then there are the levels themselves. There are 4 levels, and I only found 2 of them to be what I would call a fun challenge. The first level, 25 meters, is pretty good fun, once you get used to Mario's hangover and all the other problems with the physics. And 100 meters is fun because Big Ape go brrr, and I think it's the easiest stage in the entire game as well. As for the other 2 levels, well, the Pie Factory stage is frustrating. Pie Factory? Those are supposed to be cement? Whatever, Pie Factory. First, the obstacles themselves are difficult to get around, but add on top of this that everything on this stage moves all of the time. The ground moves, the ladders move, the goddamn monkey moves. I would say it's the hardest stage, but the hardest stage is actually 75 meters. 75 meters sucks. It's the worst stage in Smash Brothers. Don't even think about adding me, you know it's true. And it's the worst stage here. This is the stage where I learned that Mario has a deadly calcium deficiency, as his bones will turn into complete dust at the simple drop of a hat. If you jump ever so slightly down, his kneecaps will shoot through his skull at the speed of sound and he's dead on the scene. This happens quite a bit because you're dealing with different height platforms, and the platforms are moving. This in and of itself isn't that bad, but it gets so much worse, because once you get past that little obstacle course, you have to deal with this absolute barrage of bullshit on the right side of the map. Donkey Kong won't stop using his Necronomicon to summon springs from the depths of hell and throw them in your direction. And honestly, once I got to the spring section, that was enough for me to not want to play the game anymore. I was ready to write the entire thing off right then and there as a mediocre money muncher, but then it hit me during the research. Look, this is pretty much the first platformer game. Sure, it's not a great platformer, in fact it's pretty bad, but then I looked at the first of other types of games and it all sort of came together. I think that the closest comparison that I would make is to the original Street Fighter. Unlike Donkey Kong, Street Fighter isn't the first in its genre technically, but the groundwork for something great is in there. Some of the elements that would go on to make Street Fighter 2 a massive success were there, but they were just the worst versions of them. However, the big difference here is I would never ever recommend anyone play Street Fighter 1 for any reason, but Donkey Kong does have its charms. It's not a game that I enjoyed, but it is one that is better than other games from the similar period, And also, again, this is the start of a whole genre. I have to cut it at least some slack. After thinking about it that way, I started to give the game the slack that it really did deserve, but I don't think that I would outright recommend it to anyone. As far as my top list, it makes it kind of weird to put on there then. I thought about outright removing it, but that seems like the wrong choice considering it is such a historical moment. I mean, it launched Nintendo, Mario, and the platformer game, all of which would be entwined with one another to bring innovation to the gaming space for decades. If you grew up in the 1980s and had a Nintendo, your mom probably called video games a Nintendo. I mean, we're talking about one of the largest gaming companies and the largest gaming character. I guess you could compare Donkey Kong to like old Disney movies. Sure, they haven't probably held up as well as you thought they did from when you were a child, and they aren't going to compare to movies that came out now, but they have a historical precedent behind them, as well as you can still enjoy them for making the right and wrong moves. They were both foraying into a genre and a style that had never been done before, so to try and compare them to something like a new film or a new game just doesn't seem exactly fair. The difference is I can find some enjoyment out of watching Snow White, and I can just skip to the dwarves section and have fun that way. But with Donkey Kong, I just don't think it's that fun of a game to play today. For those reasons, I'm going to keep it on the list, as I do think that it is one of the most important games of all time, but also if it was a game that I would recommend to people, it's not. It's not on the list of my personal top 100 games that I enjoy. But if we're looking at the top 100 games from a more objective community standpoint, then I can understand why it's on there. For those reasons, I decided to put it at spot 75 because I think that's a good fit for it. It's not outright the worst thing I've ever played, so putting it really lower doesn't make any sense. And also, even though it is historical, it's not the most fun arcade game I've ever played, so it doesn't make sense to put it above 50. But you can join me next week as we head back into the arcade and add in our first game to the list, which I think does deserve the history and has the modern day play appeal. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
That's right, we're Japanese.